Welcome back, everybody. This is the start of Section 8, which begins our discussion of the court system. Once again, this course is very, very United States centric, but if you're not outside of the United States, you should find, information about your country's court system, not this one. But here's our funny internet picture of the day. Good, the thought that an attorney accidentally sued themselves, that makes me happy. Warms my cold little heart. All right, so where did courts come from? What's the history there? Well, ever since humans have been humans, we've had disputes, right? Oh, he took my thing, or she stole this, or, he assaulted me, or, all these things. In the beginning, if it was a tribal society, you would go to the tribal leaders, who are usually the elders. If it was a feudal society, you would go to the king or the emperor or the, whatever thing was there. But these kings and emperors quickly got kind of overwhelmed with dealing with nothing but these disputes. So they appointed people to listen and decide on these disputes in their stead. Okay, and these were the first judges. And the judges would sit there and they would listen to, one side of the argument, then they would listen to the other side of the argument, and they would ask questions, and they would figure stuff out, and then they would decide who was right and who was wrong. So they were kind of judge and jury in one. Sometimes it was one person, sometimes it was a group of people, but it was always kind of they got to decide. In the beginning, those judges could always be overruled by the king or the emperor or whoever was above them in that government structure, right? Today, in the United States and in most countries, courts can't be overruled by anybody but a higher court, right? So in the United States, there's no way that any other branch of government can overrule what the U.S. Supreme Court says. The only possible way to change, for anybody outside of the Supreme Court to change a Supreme Court ruling would be to pass a constitutional amendment, which, sure, it's possible, but in the almost 250 years of our country's history, it's only happened 27 times. So it's a very complicated, very difficult process to change the Constitution. But that would be the only way that in the United States we could change the essentially the impact of what courts ruled. Okay? So the vast majority of all law that happens in American courts is civil law. Okay? Again, we focus mostly on the criminal because this is an introduction to criminal justice class, but civil law is much, much, much more common. If you go to a law school, in your 2 or 3 years of law school, you will have 1, maybe 2 classes on criminal law. Like, the rest of it's all about civil law. There are different kinds of civil law, though. One of the most popular is torts. And a tort is just a fancy word for one person suing another person, right? So I actually had to sue somebody many, many, many years ago. I worked for somebody for a couple of weeks and then decided that the job was absolutely insane and quit. And my old boss never paid me for the time that I worked. So I had to take him to civil court. That was a tort where I was suing for, I don't even remember how much money, based on what he owed me, okay? Other kinds of civil law are things like contracts, right? So if one person, if 2 people sign a contract, and one person doesn't live up to their end of the bargain, the other person can go to court and sue to have that contract enforced by the legal system. Divorce. Divorce is another kind of civil law matter. I love Monster. Divorce is 2 people get married, which is a contract. A marriage is essentially a civil law contract, and then a divorce is kind of the dissolution of that civil law contract. Medical malpractice, right? So if a doctor does something and messes me up, I can sue the doctor to, get some money. But there's tons of other kinds of civil law. There's administrative law and maritime law and all this different stuff, and it's all fundamentally different than criminal law. One of the big differences is the burden of proof. So in criminal law, in order to get a conviction or a guilty verdict, you have to prove to the jury beyond a reasonable doubt, which is not strictly defined as like 99% sure or 97% sure or anything like that, but it is a very, very, very difficult standard to reach. In civil law, the burden of proof is the preponderance of the evidence, meaning whichever side has more than 50% likelihood to be right, they're the ones that win. Okay? In civil law, in criminal law, cases are initiated by the government, the prosecutor, my allergies are killing me. I apologize, but so in criminal law, all criminal trials are initiated by the government. In civil law, it can be initiated by the government, but the vast majority of the time it's initiated by private parties, right? It's just me as John Q. Citizen, or my business, right, or a university, or some organization, but it's usually initiated by those people. Okay, in criminal law, the two sides are the prosecution and the defense. In civil law, it's the plaintiff and the defense. Okay, the plaintiff is the person who started the proceeding, the person who did the suing, the person who initiated the divorce, and then the defense is the person being sued or being investigated or being, whatever. And each of them has their own separate financial responsibility, meaning if I sue somebody, I have to pay for that. In some states and in some cases, I might get that money back at the end of the trial if I win, but I still have to pay up front for it. Okay? Now, in the United States, we have a dual system. Okay? There is not one court system in the United States. There's the federal courts and there's the state courts. And of course, with the state courts, there's 50 different systems, right? But the federal courts and the state courts are two completely separate things, right? There's also a hierarchy. So whether you're talking about the U.S. court system or the state courts, excuse me again. Whether you're talking about the U.S. court system or the state court systems, there's a hierarchy of courts, meaning that there's the lower level courts, and then there's courts above that are more powerful than those, and then there's courts above that are more powerful than those. In the federal system and in most state systems, there are essentially 4 levels. And we're going to talk about what those 4 levels are in the next subsection. But in the United States, you can also divide the federal court system into 13 different chunks called circuits. Okay? And each circuit has its own court of appeals. And we'll talk about exactly what the job of the U.S. Court of Appeals is. Ugh. I'm getting allergy shots, but they're not working fast enough. So these 13 circuits each have their own separate geographic area that they kind of rule. Okay, there's the 9th Circuit is out on the West Coast. The 5th Circuit is is Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and Arkansas or something. The 11th Circuit is like Georgia, Alabama, that kind of area. So each circuit has its own little geographic area that they rule, essentially. A lot of times when discussing courts and judicial decisions, you'll hear this term activist judges. activist judges is a term I really hate. Activist judges is just a way to say, I disagree with that judge's ruling. Well, duh. Half the country is going to disagree with a lot of these Supreme Court rulings or lower court rulings or whatever. That doesn't make them an activist. I mean, judges are supposed to be activists. They're supposed to apply their interpretation of the law. That's their job. That's what we pay them to do. The term activist judges, I just don't get. So if you're in any of my classes, please do not use that term in any of your papers or any of your discussion posts or whatever, because that's, I hate that term. So, state courts. There are 50 different state court systems. Okay, they're all different. We're not going to talk very much about the state court systems because they're all different. Law school in your state, but essentially there are some things we can talk about when it comes to state courts. Okay, they all have a hierarchy system like the federal circuit or the federal court system. In many cases, there's just like one lower tier and then a Supreme Court, but in some cases there's 4, right? In some cases, there's more than that. But there are lower courts and higher courts, and I believe all 50 states have a Supreme Court. If they don't call it a Supreme Court, it essentially is a Supreme Court. It's whatever, there's one top, court system where there is nothing higher within that state. Now, there's a thing in the Constitution called the Supremacy Clause, which basically says whenever the federal government and the state governments disagree, federal government wins. This also applies to the court system. So a state Supreme Court decision can be appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court can overrule what the state Supreme Court or any state court has done. It doesn't work the other way around. A U.S. Supreme Court judgment or decision cannot be appealed to a state's Supreme Court. The federal government Supreme Court is above and more powerful than the state Supreme Court position. Okay. In addition to the 50 states, the United States has a half a dozen or more territories that it oversees: Puerto Rico, Guam, District of Columbia, Virgin Islands. All of these territories are under federal law. This means that they don't have their own kind of state court system. They just have the federal government court system in their territories. In addition to the regular hierarchy of courts, many states are starting to do specialized courts. So if you get arrested for a specific crime, you will get sent to a specific specialized court just for that crime. The most common ones, the most obvious ones, the ones that are kind of talked about in the media the most are drug courts. So if you get arrested for drug use, you're a drug addict, they might send you specifically to a special drug court, which deals only with drug cases, and you can get a little more specialized attention. The judge knows more about it. The judge will be able to know better what your options are and all these things. There are domestic violence courts, etc., etc. There are all kinds of interesting specialized courts that have arisen in the last few decades that are specifically for one group of crimes. Make sense? All right, I'm going to go ahead and end this subsection, and I will be back talking about the organization of the federal court system.